Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 579. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to talk about on today's show, including the Israeli drone attack on Iran, so you don't want to miss this show, and help me out by sharing the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute, where I am the news editor. It's reposted on the blog at antiwar.com, where I am the opinion editor. You can find the show on YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee if you'd like to watch the video version. If you just want the audio only, it's up anywhere audio podcasts are available. And of course, follow me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_. All right, let's get into the news. So Dave DeCamp wrote this up at antiwar.com in the early morning hours of April 19th. Israel launches attack on Iran. U.S. officials told multiple media outlets that Israel launched an attack against Iran early Friday morning. The Iranian news agency reported explosions in a province of Iran south of Tehran. Sources told the news outlet that the explosions were the result of air defenses destroying 3 micro drones. ABC News reported that missiles targeted Iran, but Iranian officials told Reuters that no missile attack was carried out. And so there's 2 possibilities here, of course. One is that there was a missile attack that didn't cause, was defeated, and Iran is attempting to downplay what Israel did in order to de-escalate the situation. The other one is that this really was an attack of just 3 small drones, and the Iranians were able to locate those drones and take them out with their air defenses. So far, Israel has not officially taken credit for the attack, and I have seen some Iranian officials say that they defeated the Israeli attack, but I guess, from the Iranian government, from Tehran, there hasn't been any official blame placed on Israel for the attack. Other reports say explosions have hit Syria and Iraq, with activity reported in those areas, and so it's possible that Israel carried out some attacks in other countries as well, and all this would have been in response to what is now the tit-for-tat escalations between Iran and Israel that started when Israel launched an attack and killed 16 people by bombing the Iranian consulate in Damascus. And so that was a significant escalation. Of course, then we have Iran fire over 300 missiles, drones, cruise missiles at Israel, doing some damage to 2 air bases, having a few missiles being able to beat the Israeli air defenses, even though the U.S., the Brits, and the Jordanians were helping the Israelis shoot down the incoming Iranian missiles. And so, there seems to be a few interesting aspects to this story. One, the U.S. didn't seem quite happy with Israel that Tel Aviv was choosing to go this route to strike back against Iran. The White House seemed pretty clear that they wanted Israel to do essentially what Iran is doing now, which is to say, we defeated the attack, we could declare victory in this exchange and just move on from it. But rather, the Israelis said we had to issue some kind of response. We have to bomb Iran. And so I'm not sure. This seems questionable to me as far as the scale of the attack. Would Israel really try to do something so small? Maybe I'm misunderstanding about what these drones actually were. Maybe Israel miscalculated. They thought these smaller drones would be able to, carry still a sizable amount of explosion, but to a very specific target because it would be able to beat the Iranian air defense systems. Does Israel have more planned? Was this maybe a distraction? They really thought they could hit higher level Iranian targets in Iraq or Syria. We still, there's a lot of details of this strike that have not come out yet, and what, if anything, happened in Iraq and Syria as far as Israeli attacks go. But as far as the statements that I have seen on Friday morning from Iranian officials, they seem prepared to do what the Biden administration asked Israel to do after the Iranian attack, which is to declare victory and move on. In the past, Iran has said in the lead up after the Iranian attack on Israel, that would have been last weekend, The Iranians said, if the Israelis strike back, then we'll strike back. But it seems that they're prepared in this case to say that this was actually, we're going to claim victory in this exchange and move on. And so, if that's what happens, I do think, kind of in the view of the world international community, Tehran is going to look far, far more reasonable than Tel Aviv. Israel started this by bombing the Iranian consulate in Damascus, killing 16 people. This is something that I think a lot of the world took note of and thought that this was out of line by Israel. And then the Iranian response, of course, doesn't kill anyone, is telegraphed well in advance. Most of the missiles, drones are shot down before they even reach Israeli skies, and they do some minor damage to a military base that Israel knew they were going to hit. And so, in one way, it signaled that to Tel Aviv that, hey, even with all this advance notice, even with this limited strike, at the end of the day, we could still hit your military bases. And so that presents a real threat to Tel Aviv, and a reason for Tel Aviv to maybe tread carefully when attacking Iran in the future. At the same time, they didn't do so much damage. They didn't kill a bunch of Israelis, which creates all this overwhelming, political need in Israel to carry out some kind of attack on Iran. So I think this could be the end of the escalation cycle, but Israel could have more planned. And so I would still say, if there's going to be another escalation at this point, I would assume that it would be from Tel Aviv, not Iran. All right. Next up here, this one from Kevin Gastola. U.S. government rejects Australia's call to end Assange case, submits assurances for extradition. So and this is at his website, The Dissenter. Faced with a decline by the deadline set by the British High Court of Justice, the United States Embassy in London submitted assurances to potentially avoid an appeal in the case against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. The assurances came the day after the Wall Street Journal reported that the Australian government asked the U.S. to offer Assange, an Australian citizen, a felony plea deal that would allow him to return home. Instead of ending the case, the U.S. State Department provided a diplomatic note to the Crown Prosecution Service that contained assurances related to the issue raised by Assange's legal team and upheld by the High Court. The issues involved the First Amendment and the risk of the death penalty. The U.S. Embassy in London claimed Assange will not be prejudiced by reason of his nationality with respect to which defense he may seek to raise at trial and sentencing. Specifically, if extradited, Assange will have the ability to raise and seek to rely upon at trial, which includes any sentencing hearing, the rights and protections given under the First Amendment of the Constitution to the United States. And there's something really crazy about this statement, of course, because the case against Assange is the biggest attack on the First Amendment in maybe U.S. history here. And so, to say that he's going to get all the rights under the First Amendment as they're violating, not necessarily that Assange needs or has First Amendment rights, but should he be brought to the United States, he would then have them, adds to journalism, which are explicitly protected by the First Amendment. So the U.S. Embassy added a decision as to the applicability of the First Amendment is exclusively within the purview of the U.S. courts. Notably, the assurance did not specify whether the U.S. government believes First Amendment rights under the Constitution extend to foreign nationals. The embassy stated, a sentence of death is neither sought nor imposed on Assange. The United States is able to provide such assurances as Assange is not charged with death penalty eligible offenses, and the United States assurances that he will not be tried for death eligible offenses. Now, one thing I want to add in here is just to say that the 175-year sentence he is charged with is essentially a death sentence, and the conditions of U.S. prisons could also, provide an early death to Assange. So his trial really is a death penalty trial. Except the death penalty assurances did not address the concern that Assange may be charged with aiding or abetting treason or more serious charge of espionage that could lead to the death penalty. A hearing on the assurances will be held on May 20th. If the High Court is satisfied with the assurances, including the reasoning for the First Amendment does not extend to Assange, then Assange will be denied an appeal against extradition. All options for fighting extradition in the UK legal system will be exhausted. In a statement, Stella Assange, that's Julian's wife, declared the United States has issued non-assurances in relation to the First Amendment and standard assurances in relation to the death penalty. It makes no undertaking to withdraw the prosecution's previous assertion that Assange has no First Amendment rights because he is not a U.S. citizen. Instead, the U.S. has limited itself to blatant weasel words claiming as Julian can't seek to raise the First Amendment if extradited. And so everybody, really keep up with Kevin's work. He is probably maybe the best journalist on the Assange stuff in the U.S. right now. Yeah, I'm sure we'll get some more updates in the coming month, but really May 20th is going to be a very big day for Julian now. All right, next up here, House votes to extend warrantless spying program. This one from our friend Will Porter at antiwar.com on April 12th. U.S. lawmakers have passed a bill reauthorizing the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, a law which allows the government to surveil American citizens without a warrant. A small group of Republicans previously blocked the vote but allowed it to proceed following a minor amendment to the law. The 2-year extension passed the House on Friday in a bipartisan vote of 273 to 147, with 126 Republicans and 147 Democrats voting for the bill, which will now proceed to the Senate. Though lawmakers also debated an amendment that would have forced the federal agencies to obtain warrants before spying on Americans, the vote failed in a tie. It was broken. The tie is broken by the House Speaker, Mike Johnson. So he had previously been against the Section 702 FISA spying, and then as soon as he becomes House Speaker, he completely reverses course. Republican Representative Thomas Massie said, "This is how the Constitution dies. This is a sad day for America." He noted that House Speaker Mike Johnson provided the tie-breaking vote to kill the warrant requirement. Though Johnson was once a vocal critic of FISA Section 702, which handed U.S. intelligence agencies sweeping powers to spy on Americans in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, he quickly reversed course after his promotion to House Speaker. "When I was a member of the House Judiciary Committee, I saw all the abuses of the FBI. There were terrible abuses over and over and over," Johnson told reporters earlier this week, explaining his about face. "And then when I became Speaker, I got confidential briefings from some other perspectives on all of that to understand the necessity of 702 of FISA and how important it is for national security, and it gave me a different perspective." Fellow Republicans have been critical of Johnson's abrupt 180, with Florida Congresswoman Matt Gaetz saying the Speaker's opposition to FISA was a view he deeply held like 20 minutes ago. Georgia Rep. Marjorie Taylor Greene has gone further, threatening to advance a vote to oust Johnson from his position over FISA, among other complaints, and we'll get into those other complaints in a minute here. The White House also worked to kill the Warren Amendment. Both Attorney General Merrick Garland and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan reached out to lawmakers on Friday morning to urge them to vote it down, according to unnamed sources cited by the NBC News. And there's a really good point made by Daniel McAdams on the Ron Paul Liberty Report, and former guest of this program, who said that, this could really amount to and seem like a threat to some of these congressmen, right? You have Merrick Garland, the head of the Justice Department, saying that, this warrantless surveillance is really, really important, and you would be very, very unwise to vote against it. Maybe if you vote against it, suddenly the FBI is looking into you. So the senior officials argued that the amendment would make the U.S. less safe and would prevent the government from lawfully collected information already in its possession to identify and disrupt critical threats to the American people. Isn't it kind of funny that this is, again, they have a law that violates the Constitution, but then they say, well, we lawfully collect everybody's information because we have this, but the law that we're trying to get rid of is that particular law. And so it's absurd to call it lawful when it's unconstitutional. All right, next up here, Speaker Johnson unveils $95 billion foreign military aid bills. So on Wednesday, House Speaker Mike Johnson, he's from Louisiana, Republican, unveiled 3 foreign military aid bills for Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, totaling over $95 billion in spending. The 3 bills match roughly with the $95 billion foreign military aid bill that was passed by the Senate, although Israel will get a pretty substantial boost in military aid. Some of the economic aid for Ukraine is in the form of repayable loans. However, reports say that Kiev is not actually expected to pay it back, and the Biden administration will have the power to cancel the debt. The bill to fund the proxy war in Ukraine totals nearly $61 billion. The Israel bill totals $26 billion, the majority of which will go towards supporting the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza and replenishing air defenses following Iran's reprisal attack on Israel. It includes a $9 billion in humanitarian aid, which Democrats said was necessary for them to support Johnson's effort. Over $8 billion will go towards spending in the Asia Pacific to prepare for a future war with China, including a few billion in military aid for Taiwan. The U.S. has consistently sold weapons to Taiwan since severing diplomatic relations with Taipei in 1979, but began providing an unprecedented amount of military aid last year, a move that significantly raised tensions with Taiwan. Johnson will also work to pass a 4th bill, or so-called national security law. The bill is expected to include a tit-top ban over unfounded allegations that the popular video sharing app is a Chinese spy tool. It is also expected to give the federal government the power to sell off frozen Russian assets to make more money available for Ukraine, which would amount to outright theft. Johnson is pushing ahead with the plan despite threats from Reps Marjorie Taylor Greene and Thomas Massie to hold a vote to oust him, and I have more on that now. So I wrote this one for the Institute on April 18th. New amendment would force reps who support Ukraine aid to join Kiev's military. So Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene has proposed an amendment requiring lawmakers who vote in favor of the $60 billion Ukraine aid bill to join the country's military. Taylor Greene and Representative Massie have pledged to remove House Speaker Johnson from his post if he allows floor votes on the aid package. In a social media post, Axios' Capitol Hill reporter Julie Grace Bufik shared the text of the new amendment to the $61 billion Ukraine aid bill that has been stalled for months in Washington. The measure states any member of Congress who votes in favor of this act shall be required to conscript in the Ukrainian military. Taylor Greene posted on X, if you want to fund the endless foreign wars, you should have to go fight them. That's why I'm introducing an amendment that would go to require any member of Congress who votes for the multi-billion-dollar Ukraine supplemental to enlist in Ukraine's military. And I would ask you, Taylor Greene, if she would say support the same thing if it required her to say enlist in the Taiwanese or the Israeli military. But for now, this is a very good thing that she's doing here. The Georgia Republican also introduced amendments that would redirect the funding from Ukraine to space lasers to defend the southwest border or aid to Americans impacted by a major train derailment in Ohio and the wildfires in Hawaii. Taylor Greene introduced the amendments in retaliation after the House Speaker Johnson broke an earlier pledge to block additional funding for Ukraine proxy wars unless Congress reauthorized significant funding for U.S. immigration enforcement and various border reforms. Johnson plans to have the House vote on a series of 4 bills that will provide $61 billion to Ukraine, $26 billion to Israel, $8 billion to Taiwan and the Asia Pacific, and a 4th bill that is expected to be called a national security law that includes a tit-top ban and gives the president power to sell off frozen Russian assets and transfer the money to Ukraine. In addition to the amendment, Taylor Greene has called to oust Johnson from speakership over his broken promise. The Congresswoman has been joined by Representative Massey, which means Johnson would not survive a removal vote without support from Democrats. Taylor Greene's effort to stymie the Ukraine aid package has drawn the ire from some of her colleagues. Representative Jared Merkowitz, a Democrat from Florida, introduced 2 amendments smearing the lawmaker as an agent of Russia. The amendment says Taylor Greene has repeatedly attempted to block aid to Ukraine, empowering Vladimir Putin's unlawful violation of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. And then the amendment would name her like a special envoy of Putin in the United States or something like that, and then would rename her congressional office the Neville Chamberlain office. So the Congresswoman has vocally embraced the America First philosophy and has explained that continued funding for the war in Ukraine does nothing to benefit the American people, and that is her opposition to it. Taylor Greene has also pointed to Kiev's undemocratic policies, such as Zelensky canceling elections and the sizable neo-Nazi presence within its military, as other reasons for opposing the $61 billion aid bill. Moskowitz later attacked Taylor Greene for highlighting the hardline elements in the Ukrainian armed forces. He said, "Stop bringing up Nazis and Hitler. The only people who know about Nazis and Hitler are the 10 million people and their families who lost their loved ones, generations of people who were wiped out. It is enough of this disgusting behavior using Nazis as propaganda. You want to talk about Nazis? Get yourself over to the Holocaust Museum and see what the Nazis did." However, he has repeatedly invoked the Nazis to label his own and further his own political agenda, once declaring on X that the platform was crawling with Nazi termites, and later claiming that Hamas has similar goals to the Third Reich. And so, he's very willing to use the Nazi label when it helps his cause. All right, next up here, this one from Will Porter. Congress condemns Pro Palestinian slogan as anti-Semitic. U.S. lawmakers voted overwhelmingly to condemn a popular Pro Palestinian slogan as anti-Semitic, with Representative Thomas Massey the sole Republican to oppose the bill. The legislation claims the slogan "From the river to the sea" is a call to arms and a rallying cry to destroy Israel. The measure passed the House in a vote of 377, 41-1. On Tuesday, as Massey joined 43 progressives across the aisle who voted no, though Democratic Representative Maladine Dean broke ranks with other lawmakers with a present vote. Strong bipartisan support allowed the bill to easily sail through the lower chamber. The resolution declared that the slogan "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," a chant that is commonly used by pro-Palestinian activists around the world, is anti-Semitic and that it must be condemned. This slogan is an anti-Semitic call to arms with the goal of the eradication of the state of Israel, which is located between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. The bill reads, adding that the phrase seeks to deny the Jewish people the right of self-determination and calls for the removal of the Jewish people from their ancestral homeland. Although they just stated that the state of Israel exists between the river to the sea, and you could say if you're making that statement about the Palestinian version of that, you're essentially doing the opposite with the Israel version of that, and that is from the Palestinian perspective, then couldn't that just be called a call to remove all Palestinians and to not have a Palestinian state? So the legislation goes on to claim that terrorist organizations and their sympathizers have used those slogans as a rallying cry to destroy destroy Israel and exterminate the Jewish people. The first half of the slogan, from the river to the sea, has been long history, even predating the state of Israel, once used both by the Zionist and Arab faction seeking an independent state within historic Palestine. A longer version was adopted by the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, and later Hamas, and has since been used extensively by pro-Palestinian activists across the political spectrum. Israel's ruling Likud party has also employed variations of the slogan in its own documents, with the party's founding charter declaring that between the sea and the Jordan River, there will only be Israeli sovereignty, explicitly denying the possibility of a future Palestinian state. The phrase has since been removed from the party charter, though some Israeli politicians continue to use it in public. Then Likud member of the Knesset, Gideon Sadar, said during a 2020 campaign speech, he used it, and then Prime Minister Netanyahu has vocally opposed the creation of a Palestinian state over the decades. He recently told reporters any future arrangement, Tel Aviv would retain control over all territories west of the Jordan River. Last November, Democratic Rep. Rashida Tlaib was censored by fellow lawmakers over her comments about Israel, as well as a video she posted online which showed protesters chanting "River to the Sea" slogan. At the same time, she insisted the phrase was an aspirational call to freedom and does not propose death, destruction, or hate. And I would say, from my understanding, the phrase always was meant like from the river to the sea, Palestinians will be free, which means, they won't live under the Israeli apartheid system that they are currently subjected to. All right, next up here, this one from Brett Wilkins that we reprinted at antiwar.com. 26 House Democrats voiced deep concern over Biden claims that Israel is illegally using U.S. arms, or that the Biden claim that Israel is legally using U.S. arms. So more than 24 House Democrats on Tuesday challenged the Biden administration's claim that Israel is using U.S.-supplied weapons in compliance with domestic and international law, an assertion made amid ongoing World Court probe of plausible Israeli genocide policies and practices in Gaza, citing mounting credible and deeply troubling reports and allegations of human rights crimes committed by Israeli troops in Gaza and soldiers and settlers in the occupied West Bank. 26 congressional Democrats, led by Texas Reps Veronica Escobar, and who co-chairs President Biden's re-election campaign, and Joaquin Castro, who asked the U.S. State Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines whether and how their agencies determine Israel is lawfully using arms provided by Washington. And this is interesting because there's a new article out in ProPublica as well, which says that Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, has actually received reports and recommendations from his staff that say that Israel has used, and this is prior to October 7th, but Israeli forces in the West Bank were using U.S. weapons out of compliance with U.S. law, and that, they should be cut off for that reason. And Blinken has essentially been sitting on those reports since December. And that, has other implications as well, because the White House, basically press spokesperson John Kirby, has come out and said that the U.S. has not assessed that Israel is violating international law or has done anything illegal in Gaza. All right, next up here, this is a really important story. Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. U.S. vetoes Palestinian bid for full UN membership. On Thursday, the U.S. vetoed a UN Security Council resolution that would have granted Palestine status as a full UN member state, a move that goes against President Biden's claim that he favors a two-state solution. The U.S. was the only member of the 15-member council to vote against the resolution, while the UK and Switzerland abstained. There were 12 votes in favor, including Russia, China, France, Japan, South Korea, Ecuador, Algeria, Malta, Slovenia, Sierra Leone, Mozambique, and Guyana. A resolution needs 9 votes to pass, but the U.S. and the 4 other permanent members of the council, that is China, Russia, France, and the UK, have veto power. Before the vote, The Intercept reported that the U.S. was lobbying other countries to vote against the U.S. resolution, so the U.S. wouldn't have to veto it, but we ended up having to veto it anyways, and this is just awful. The Biden administration has come under criticism for claiming to favor a peace deal that involves a two-state solution while continuing to provide unconditional military aid and diplomatic support to Israel, and doing things like this at the UN, like explicitly coming out and working against and then vetoing making Palestine a member of the UN, which would, pave their way to have a state. All right, next up here, this one I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on April 17th. UN report finds Palestinians face severe abuses in Israeli detention. The UN aid agency for Palestinians, UNRWA, released a report showing that Gazans rounded up by the Israeli military have been subjected to severe abuses. UNRWA found some of its employees were subjected to coercion and forced to make false statements about the organization's alleged ties to Hamas. Tel Aviv used those confessions to persuade Washington and over a dozen other nations to cut funding to UNRWA. Published on Tuesday, the new report details how Israeli soldiers in Gaza have rounded up thousands of people throughout the months-long conflict. Those Palestinians have been moved into various detention centers across Israel and face inhumane conditions and brutal treatment. So these are some quotes from the report. Ill treatment, including being subject to beatings while made to lie on a thin mattress on top of rubble for hours without food, water, or access to a toilet. Their legs and hands bound with plastic ties. And we do know from other reports, including a doctor who, wrote about how wrong the practice was, that binding hands on end like this with the plastic ties as tightly as they're doing is causing cuts in the skin that lead to infections, that lead to amputations, and at times those amputations are so poorly medically treated it leads to death. Back to the UNRWA report, several detainees reported being forced into cages and attacked by dogs. Some released detainees, including a child, had a dog bite wounds on their body. Detainees were threatened with prolonged detention, injury, or the killing of family members if they did not provide requested information. Some of those who endured torture were UNRWA employees who were forced to make false confessions about the agency's supposed ties to the Palestinian militant group Hamas. So the report says UNRWA staff reported being subject to threats and coercion while in detention and being pressed during interrogations to make forced confessions about the agency, including that the agency has affiliations with Hamas and that UNRWA staff took part in the October 7th attack against Israel. And so the report went on to detail the horrific abuses inflicted on the Palestinians by their Israeli captors, the ill treatment and abuse against UNRWA staff members, as relayed by staff members themselves, include severe physical beatings and treatment akin to waterboarding, resulting in extreme physical suffering, beatings by doctors when referred for medical assistance, exposure to and being attacked by dogs, threats of rape and electrocution, threats of violence with guns pointed at them, verbal and psychological abuse, threats of murder, injury, or harm to family members, humiliating and degrading treatment, being forced to strip naked and being photographed while they are being undressed, and being forced to hold stressed positions. So this, it sounds like the Israelis have, created a bunch of Abu Ghraib, Gitmo style prisons across detention centers, I guess more likely, within Israel. And they're just rounding up thousands of Palestinians and subjecting them all to this treatment. In January, as the International Court of Justice was preparing to rule on whether Israel was committing genocide in Gaza, Tel Aviv compiled what it dubbed an intelligence dossier that accused UNRWA staffers of working alongside Hamas and even taking part in the October 7th attack on Israel. Secretary of State Antony Blinken later said the Israeli claims were highly credible, and Washington and several other nations cut funding to UNRWA based on these allegations. Various human rights officials and organizations have explained that UNRWA is crucial in preventing famine in Gaza and warned that cutting funding would accelerate the rate of starvation in the Strip. Over the past 3 months, Tel Aviv has failed to produce evidence to back its claims, and several nations have resumed their funding for UNRWA. Israeli forces also robbed detained Palestinians, according to the new report. Detainees described having all items in their possessions confiscated, including identification documents and money, at the same time of their detention, and generally not returned after their release, it said. And if you think about it, if somebody's maybe fleeing a war zone, they may have a significant amount of their life savings on them. So we could be talking about substantial amount of money being stolen from these Palestinians. And even if it's not maybe substantial amount of money from the Israeli perspective, certainly from the Palestinian perspective it is. If you're on the brink of famine and the price of food is skyrocketing, any amount of money is going to be critical to helping your family survive. So, importantly, UNRWA is not the first agency to report that Palestinians detained in Gaza are subject to torture. Israeli outlets Plus 972 magazine and Haaretz have also highlighted the torture and abuse of Palestinians that are arrested by the Israelis. And so the UNRWA report also includes claims that detainees, including women, face sexual abuse while in custody. Women describe being exposed to psychological abuse, including insults as threats, as well as inappropriate touching during searches, and as a form of intimidation and harassment while blindfolded. Both men and women report being made to strip naked in front of male soldiers during searches and being photographed and filmed while naked. And so, I mean, this is just horrific humiliation that's being subject to huge numbers of the Palestinian, the Gazan population. All right, next up here, Israel's Ben-Gvir calls for executing Palestinians to make room in prisons. And so as the Israelis have rounded up all these Palestinians and are torturing them all, they've come into a problem, which is they don't have enough room for all of them. And so the solution, Ben-Gvir says, is to start shooting them. So Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir has called for the execution of Palestinians to make room in Israel's overcrowded prisons. Ben-Gvir, the hardline Jewish Power Party leader, said he was happy that the Israeli government approved the construction plan to expand prisons, but said that the best solution was the death penalty. The additional construction will allow the prison service to make room for more terrorists, and will bring a partial solution to the prison crisis that exists. The death penalty for terrorists is the right solution to the incarceration problem. Until then, glad that the government approved the proposal I brought. According to Middle East Eye, the Israeli Public Defender's Office published a report that said that some of Israeli prisons have been declared in a state of emergency due to intolerable overcrowding and poor conditions. Several thousands of Palestinians have been detained in Gaza since October 7th. Many have reported severe abuse. As Israel's National Security Minister, Ben-Gvir oversees the Israeli prison service. He has been pushing for a bill that would mandate the death penalty for Palestinians found guilty of terrorism in Israeli courts. And so this is absolutely terrifying. And you would think that there would maybe be people in Tel Aviv who would be screaming at Ben-Gvir just to shut his mouth. To, if he wants to go beat Palestinians on the street, or he wants to go do stupid stuff, that's one thing. But this guy is routinely taking to Twitter and calling for insane policies. You have to imagine that there would be elements within the Israeli government who, maybe they see this guy as an inconvenience, but they would be really asking him to close his mouth for a few weeks. And it's his extreme rhetoric, which is one of the few things that really makes any American politicians even take notice of the abuse of the Palestinians. All right, next up here, Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. UN Rights Office says Israel still imposing unlawful restrictions on aid to Gaza. And the importance of this here is just that Israel and the U.S. are claiming, oh, Israel's allowing more aid to Gaza. Israel's allowing more aid into Gaza, when it seems pretty clear that the UN and all these aid agencies are saying that that's not the case. All right, so White House says U.S. Israel have shared objective to see Hamas defeated in Rafah. This is highly disturbing. The White House said in a statement on Thursday that the U.S. and Israel have a shared objective to see Hamas defeated in Gaza, the southern Gaza city that has been packed with over 1 million Palestinian civilians. The statement came following talks between the U.S. and Israeli officials that covered Iran's reprisal attack on Israel and Israel's plans to invade Rafah. The U.S. has expressed concerns about potential assault because it will cause mass civilian casualties, but it appears to ultimately be supportive of the idea of attacking the city. And so, again, this is highly problematic. I'm not sure if we're going to see the attack on Rafah occur soon. I think it's highly possible. All right, next up here, this from Rich Sterling. We published it at antiwar.com. German police shut down Palestinian conference. And, you know, we kind of started off the Israel section here talking about how the American government is trying to crack down on the pro Palestinian speech. This is taken to extremes in Germany, Dell. So a 3-day Palestinian conference in Berlin was forcibly shut down after 3 hours on Friday. Electricity was abruptly terminated in the midst of a presentation by Salman Abdul-Sidah, the 87-year-old author of Atlas of Palestine. Former Greek finance ministers and leaders of DiEM25 were prevented from entering Germany to attend the conference. He went on Twitter X to send a message. Do you know that the German Interior Minister has just banned me from entering Germany? Indeed, if that were not enough, I have been banned from talking to you via Zoom or indeed through a video message like this, exactly like this. The threat being that I will be tried in Germany for breaking German law. Why? Because of the speech that I published yesterday on my blog calling for universal human rights in Israel-Palestine. So my question to my German friends, to Germans in general, whether you agree with me or does it not matter, in this banning in your name, it is something that you feel comfortable happening in your democracy. From my perspective, this is essentially the death knell of the prospects of democracy in the Federal Republic of Germany. Last up here, this is a pretty interesting story. Whistleblower says U.S. putting troops in danger by refusing to leave Niger. The Biden administration's refusal to withdraw from Niger despite an order from the post-coup government to leave has put U.S. troops in the country in danger, a senior Air Force leader said in a letter to Congress that was obtained by the Washington Post. The whistleblower said that the senior officials at the U.S. Embassy in Niger have intentionally suppressed intelligence to maintain the facade of a country-to-country relationship as the U.S. is trying to figure out a way to maintain its military presence in the country. Of course, the U.S. spent all this money building expensive military bases in Niger, and then a coup happened because largely as repercussions from the U.S. war in Libya under Obama that overthrew Gaddafi and spread jihadism into the Sahel. Niger became very unstable. There's a lot of attacks, terrorist attacks against the people, just horrible things like men on motorbikes showing up at a village and killing dozens, if not 100 people. This was happening for years in Niger, and so eventually you have this military leadership sweep into power. I think basically they wanted anyone who would take a strong position against these militants, and so we are now in a position that government doesn't want the U.S. there, and the U.S. has basically just ignored it. And so it seems to me maybe one of the biggest problems in all of this is that the way the Nigerian leadership now is trying to prevent the U.S. and force the U.S. out is by not allowing the U.S. to bring new troops into Niger. And so rather than allowing the current U.S. troops that are there to rotate out, they're being forced to stay. And so I'm not sure. I'm guessing the U.S. is going to have to eventually leave. But if I were a part of the leadership in Niger, I would be very concerned that the U.S. was plotting a coup and they're just trying to buy enough time to get that coup up and off the ground, remove you from power, and bring in a government that isn't going to make them leave. But we will see. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the show. More next week.